Today I'd like to continue our journey through chapter 13 of the Gospel of Matthew. In this section of Matthew, Jesus is speaking of different parables, and he uses the parables as examples of what his kingdom is like and how Jesus wants to establish the kingdom. This particular parable is in verse 33 of chapter 13, and it goes like this. He spoke to them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of wheat flour until the whole batch was leavened. So the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus is trying to give the disciples and the people that are following him a little understanding of, well, what is this kingdom of heaven that you're talking about all about? Jesus has come proclaiming the kingdom of heaven, and people are like, okay, what does this mean? This kingdom of heaven, what is it about? Where is this kingdom? How do I get into the kingdom? And of course, when Jesus uses the term kingdom, it can be very misleading to his apostles and to those that are following him, because they definitely want to throw the Romans off and establish a Jewish kingdom. So there's always this tension. Well, is Jesus really talking about a revolution, a physical kingdom that he wants to establish in the here and now? Is he talking about a kingdom in the afterlife? What exactly is this kingdom that Jesus is referring to? So it's confusing for the listeners and very confusing for the disciples and the apostles. They're like, well, what exactly is Jesus saying? So Jesus is trying to give them a sense of what this kingdom is by using parables. So what about yeast? Well, yeast is usually a symbol of corruption in the Christian scriptures. So when you see yeast, you're like, well, wait a minute. We don't want to fall into that trap of becoming corrupt. Because, of course, what is going to destroy the kingdom of heaven is corruption, is sin, is evil, is turning our back on our sisters and brothers. So Jesus is trying to warn them about that. And so he uses the term yeast for that. A good example of that is Matthew chapter 16, verses 6 and 11, and 6 and then 11 to 12. And Jesus said to them, look out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Jesus is saying, those Pharisees and Sadducees, they're talking about the law, they're trying to challenge me all the time. Well, beware of that. Beware of the leaven. Because what they're really doing is they're really working against the kingdom and not for the kingdom. So then in 16, verses 11 to 12, Jesus says, how do you not comprehend that I was not speaking to you about bread? So as soon as Jesus says leaven, they're thinking bread, and they're thinking, well, can I get bread from the Pharisees and the Sadducees? And Jesus, no, I'm not talking about bread. I'm talking about something else. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, of the Sadducees. Then they understood that he was not telling them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it was that teaching that was leading the disciples astray, because the end result of some of that teaching was more a sense of rote following the law rather than the interior disposition that Jesus is trying to get at. And the kingdom of heaven is a kingdom within us. It's a kingdom of our relationship with God and with our sisters and brothers. That's what the true leaven, true yeast, is all about. Now, Jesus talks about 3 measures of wheat flour. 3 measures is an enormous amount. 3 measures is enough to feed 100 people. So the exaggeration of this element of the parable points to the greatness of the kingdom's effect. This kingdom is going to transform your life and the lives of other people. If you really embrace this kingdom, if you really try to follow what Jesus is saying, and be compassionate toward your sisters and brothers, and follow the teaching of the Beatitudes, and put others first, then truly there will be this tremendous transformation, just like the yeast and the 3 measures of flour. And that kingdom that is created will be able to sustain hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of people. Because it is a kingdom based on what? It's a kingdom based on love, relationship, and caring. The yeast hidden in the flour is symbolic. And it's symbolic of the message of Jesus, because that yeast, it's hidden, we don't see it, it's there. So it's a sense of the kingdom which is hidden, it's not obvious, but yet the yeast transforms the bread, transforms the flour. And all of a sudden you have so much more, you have a superabundance because of that yeast. So it is hidden, but then it becomes revealed. So Jesus, in talking about this parable of the yeast and the leaven and the 3 measures of flour, is talking about the power to transform people's lives. You take something that's very small, it's hidden, it's insignificant. You think, what can that do? How can that help? All of a sudden you see all of this bread and you're feeding 100 people and you're like, wow, now I see what that little yeast was able to do. And sometimes we see it in our own life, right? We see a little act of kindness that we do for someone. And it has a transforming effect on their lives. I think of the story of Thomas Merton in the 7-Storey Mountain. When he was online, and it was difficult, it was a hard time. People were having a hard time getting enough food to eat, and there was Merton online, and a stranger reaches out to him and touches his heart. And that kindness he never forgot. And we all can share examples of that, of people doing amazing things. We don't even sometimes know their name. But they reach out to us in loving kindness, and they transform our lives by the power of their love. And it's an amazing thing. And that's the kingdom of God. It seems small. It seems insignificant. It has a tremendous power to transform, to change our lives, to enrich our lives, and to help us to enrich the lives of others. Then Jesus goes on in chapter 13, in verses 34 and 35, to talk about the use of parables and why he uses parables. And Jesus says in verse 34, all these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables. And he spoke to them only in parables, to fulfill what has been said through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. Jesus is using parables. Why? Because he wants the people to understand what has been hidden. And what has been hidden is the kingdom of God, is the transforming power of God's love. It was there in the beginning, certainly. That leaven was always there. That seed was always there. The wheat was growing. But people didn't understand the connection to the kingdom of God. Jesus has come to speak in parables so that we can understand. What Matthew seems to be referring to here is Psalm 78, verse 2, which says, I will open my mouth in story, drawing lessons from of old. So we see here Jesus, the storyteller, and we see the power of stories, and the power of stories to transform our lives. So many of us can relate to that. We love reading novels, we love watching films, we love going to plays, we love hearing music, all of which tells us a story. As those stories unfold, they can touch our hearts and transform us and stay with us forever. So Jesus is using parables. Why? To let us know what God has intended from the very beginning of creation, from the very foundation of the world.